Number dying on stage, number Act 1. The invitation, number Chapter 1. The bomb, the woman checked her phone at the word, forgive. Edward saw it happen. He was standing on a piece of tape in a rented room in Midtown, three strangers behind a folding table, a speech he'd done 100 times turning to ash in his mouth, and her eyes dropped to her lap. Just for a second. Just long enough to see whatever notification was more interesting than a man begging his estranged son not to give up on him. He kept going. What else could he do? Not because I deserve it, he said, and his voice did the thing it was supposed to do, the crack, the controlled break. Because I don't know how to live anymore without trying. She was still looking at her phone. The other two behind the table, a man with a beard, a younger man with no beard, were watching Edward with the patience of people waiting for something to end. Edward finished. "Great," the woman said, looking up. "Thanks so much for coming in." He nodded, smiled, the smile he'd perfected over 30 years. "Thank you for your time." He walked out. Outside, the cold was immediate. November, the wind coming off the Hudson, the kind of cold that found the gaps in your coat and settled there. Edward stood on the sidewalk and let it find him. She checked her phone. He kept coming back to it. Not the rejection, he'd had hundreds of rejections, but the specific moment. He'd been saying, forgive. He'd been doing the thing he'd spent 30 years learning to do, and she'd looked at her phone. He started walking. "You used to be good at this." The thought arrived. He pushed it away. She was looking at her phone during the climax. He walked faster. You produced the tear. You did the voice break. You hit every beat, and she looked at her phone because she could tell. She could tell you were performing. She could tell there was nothing underneath. When did that happen? He didn't know. He couldn't point to a day, a year, a moment. It had happened gradually, a little less each time, until one day you realized you'd been running on fumes for years. James would have gotten the call back. The name surfaced before he could stop it. James Calloway. Edward kept walking, but something in him had stopped. James had been 27 when Edward met him. Brilliant in the way that made you want to quit, not just from jealousy, but because watching him work showed you what the art could be when someone was actually doing it. They'd come up through the same off-Broadway circuit. Edward had been in his early 40s by then, already sliding from promising to reliable to whatever came after reliable. James had been ascending. The Donmer had been looking for a Claudius. Edward had wanted that role the way you wanted air when you were drowning. He'd needed it, needed to prove he was still ascending, still the actor he'd believed he could be at 22. James had wanted it too. James had been perfect for it. You picked up the phone. Edward was walking very fast now. You called Martin. You said James had been difficult on his last production, drinking, missing rehearsals, problems with the stage manager. You said it with such reluctance, such concern. None of it was true. The light changed. Edward stopped at the crosswalk. James didn't get the call back. James heard why eventually the theater world was small. James stopped getting callbacks anywhere. 6 months later, he was dead. Edward closed his eyes. They said it was an accident, pills and alcohol, but you knew better, you knew what you'd taken from him. You knew that when you destroyed his career, you destroyed everything that was keeping him alive. And you got the role. And you were adequate, the word from the Guardian review, the only review that mentioned him. Edward Marsh is adequate as Claudius, though one wishes for more danger in the performance. Adequate, after 30 years, after what he'd done to James. The walk signal changed. Edward crossed. You destroyed a man, not just his career, him, and it didn't even work. You're still here, still auditioning, still adequate. He stopped. He was in front of his building. He didn't remember the last 20 blocks. He went inside. The apartment was exactly what he'd left that morning, a single room with a kitchenette and a window facing the airshaft. 11 years of life in 400 square feet. The walls were covered with playbills. Every show Edward had ever been in, framed and hung. His eyes found the one by the window, Uncle Vanya, off-Broadway, 2003. He'd played Astrov. A critic had called him magnetic. He'd kept the clipping for years until the paper yellowed and the words stopped meaning anything. He didn't turn on the lights. He sat on the edge of the bed. She checked her phone. He couldn't stop seeing it. He should eat. He should shower. He should do the things that people did when they were living their lives. Instead, he went to the closet. In the back, behind the suits he saved for callbacks that never came, there was a box. Cardboard, water-stained, taped shut. He hadn't opened it in years. He opened it now. Inside, VHS tapes. Dozens of them, every performance he'd ever managed to record, bootleg copies, camcorder footage, the occasional professional recording. The archive of a career that never happened. He pulled one out at random. The label in his own handwriting, Hamlet Rosencrantz, Stratford 1996. He didn't own a VCR anymore. But he held the tape anyway, feeling its weight. Evidence. That's what these were. Evidence of every time he'd stood on a stage and tried to become someone else. Evidence that it had happened, even if no one remembered. He'd been 28 in that production. He'd been good, not adequate, but actually alive up there, actually feeling it. What had happened to that person? He put the tape back, closed the box, shoved it into the closet. On the floor by the bed, something caught his eye. An envelope. It was on the carpet just inside the door. He must have stepped over it when he came in. Cream-colored, heavy paper. His name on the front in a script so precise it looked mechanical, in ink that seemed black until he tilted it toward the window and saw it flash dark red. Edward Marsh, no address, no stamp, no return. He picked it up. It was heavier than paper should be. It felt old, patient. He should throw it away. He knew what happened in stories when mysterious letters appeared under doors. But the box was in the closet, and the tapes were in the box, and somewhere a woman was checking her phone during the moment that was supposed to matter, and Edward was 47 years old and running out of moments. He broke the seal. The wax was dark red. The symbol pressed into it might have been a curtain parting, or a door opening, or a mouth about to speak. Dear Mr. Marsh, you are cordially invited to appear as the featured performer at Heaven's nightclub for a limited engagement of 7 nights, beginning this Friday. Compensation, $500 per performance paid nightly in cash. Please arrive at 9 p.m. The club is located at 1717 Ashford Lane. Enter through the red door. We have been watching your career with great interest and believe you have potential that has yet to be fully realized. We look forward to helping you discover it. Sincerely, the management. Edward read the letter in the dark. Featured performer. Potential that has yet to be fully realized. He laughed, rusty, more cough than laugh. He searched for Heaven's nightclub on his phone. Nothing. Searched for Ashford Lane. Nothing. This should worry him more than it did. But the letter was in his hands, and the words featured performer were right there. And the alternative was next week. And the week after that, more auditions, more plastic chairs, more women checking their phones while he performed for no one. We believe you have potential. Something believed he had potential. Something had been watching. Edward folded the letter and set it on the nightstand. Friday. He'd find out on Friday. Number Chapter 2. The red door. He spent Thursday trying to remember what it felt like to be good. The bathroom mirror was cracked and spotted with age. Edward stood in front of it and ran through his pieces. The monologues he'd been doing for 30 years. Now is the winter of our discontent. The words came out polished, professional. He watched himself and saw exactly what casting directors saw, a competent actor doing competent work. He stopped. When did you stop being terrified? He asked his reflection. Stratford, 1996. Standing in the wings, about to go on. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He remembered. He turned away from the mirror. Friday. Edward woke early, couldn't eat, couldn't sit still. At 8 p.m. he put on his good suit. The black one bought for the Donmar opening night, worn exactly once. At 8:30 he left. The subway carried him west. The A train, late evening, half empty. Edward sat in the corner and watched the stations pass. The car emptied as he went, until he was alone, watching his reflection in the black window. His reflection looked like an understudy who just learned the lead had broken his leg. The train reached the end of the line. Edward got off. The station was empty. Not just quiet, empty in a way that subway stations never were. He climbed the stairs to the street. The fog was waiting. It lay over everything like a scrim, that thin gauze they used in theater to make reality look like memory. The streetlights were just glows in the gray, the buildings just suggestions. Edward walked into it. His footsteps were the only sound. The city had gone quiet, as if someone had brought the house lights down. He passed a newsstand, shuttered and dark. The papers in the window were old, weeks old, maybe months, and they were all the same edition, the same headline repeated across every front page. He couldn't read it through the fog. He didn't try. He walked. The streets changed as he went. Newer buildings gave way to older ones, then older still. The streetlights grew sparse, then disappeared. The fog grew thicker, and then ahead. A gap in the gray, a narrow passage between two buildings, an alley barely wide enough for one person, and at the end, the red door. It was the red of theater curtains. The red of the moment before the show began, when the curtain glowed with the light behind it and the audience held its breath. He walked toward it. The alley was dark. The fog pooled around his feet like stage smoke. He was halfway down when he saw them. The figures, two of them flanking the door, tall, thin, perfectly still. He didn't look at them directly. Instinct told him not to, something old, something that lived beneath training and technique. But he saw them in the edges of his vision, and what he saw was wrong. They were shaped like people, but the proportions were off. Limbs too long, joints in wrong places, heads tilted at angles that suggested the necks beneath them bent in ways necks shouldn't. And their faces were frozen in expressions he recognized. The comedy mask, the tragedy mask, the ancient faces of theater carved in flesh instead of wood, the grinning face, the weeping face. Edward stared at them despite himself. The grinning one seemed almost gleeful, a rictus of joy that had nothing to do with happiness. The weeping one had tears carved into its cheeks, grooves that might have been wet, that might have been glistening in the fog. These are the faces of theater, he thought. The faces we wear to show the audience what they're supposed to feel. What happens when you can't take them off? He kept walking. The door was in front of him now. The red paint seemed wet in the fog, seemed almost to pulse. His hand reached for the handle. Cold, the cold of metal that had never seen sun. He felt it in his knuckles, in his teeth. Behind him, one of the figures moved. He heard it, the rustle of something shifting, the creak of a joint that didn't work right. A sound that might have been laughter from the grinning face. A sound that might have been a sob from the weeping one. He didn't turn around, turn back. This is wrong. Whatever is behind this door, but what was behind him was worse. What was behind him was the apartment and the auditions and the woman checking her phone. What was behind him was 47 years old and adequate. What was behind him was James Calloway, dead at 31, and the thing Edward had done to put him in the ground. He'd spent his whole life waiting for a door to open. Here was a door. Edward opened it. Beyond was darkness. Not the darkness of an unlit room, something deeper, something that resisted light, something with weight and presence. He stepped inside. The door closed behind him. For a moment he stood in nothing. No light, no sound. Just Edward alone in the dark, the way he'd been alone in so many darknesses before, in wings, in dressing rooms, in the moments before the lights came up. Then a light, a single flame far ahead, then another closer, then another. A path of flames, each one igniting as he approached. They lined walls he could now barely see, red walls, velvet walls, the color of the door, the color of curtains about to rise. He walked. The hallway stretched ahead, impossibly long, lined with photographs. Edward glimpsed them as he passed, faces in frames, men and women, some smiling, some not. Plaques beneath each one, too small to read in the flickering light. But one photograph caught his eye. A man in a black suit, younger than Edward, with a smile that wasn't quite a smile. The plaque beneath it said something different from the others. Not graduated, a different word. Remained. Edward walked faster. And somewhere ahead, growing clearer with every step, he heard it. The sound of an audience, not applause. Just the sound of people settling into their seats, the creak of chairs, the rustle of programs, the murmur of conversation dying away. The sound of a crowd preparing to pay attention. The sound of people waiting for a performance to begin. Featured performer, the letter had said. Edward Marsh walked toward the stage. He'd been waiting 30 years for an audience that would actually watch. He'd never imagined they might be waiting for him, too. End of Act 1.